Wow. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Gracias, Lincoln. ¿Dónde está Remedios? Siéntese, por favor. Remedios, si tú te sientes. Sit down. Como dice Barbara Bush. Gracias, Lincoln. Gracias por todo. Tenemos mucho en común, Lincoln Díaz Velar y yo. Tenemos padres increíbles. Tú viste, y yo sigo, gracias a Dios, con un padre que es el mejor hombre del mundo, en mi opinión. Sé que Lincoln tiene el mismo sentido por su papá. Tenemos esposas muy bellas, Cristina y Columba. Tenemos hermanos muy famosos. En el caso de Lincoln es José. En el caso mío es Marvin, mi hermano. Oh, sí, el otro. Que, hablando de Cuba, creo que había unos presidentes que merecen la designación del mejor apoyador por la libertad de Cuba. Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush. Remedios. I want to thank Remedios and the board for their steadfast support over the years. I had totally forgotten it's been 11 years since we gathered here, almost to the same day, to start the PAC. And I do remember the time when at that particular time there was big efforts. A lot of Republicans actually were saying we need to lift the embargo so that we can sell things to Cuba, as though Cuba would pay it back. It seemed odd to me at the time, but there was growing movement, and thanks to the leadership of Lincoln and his colleagues and the work of this PAC, that's been totally reversed now, completely reversed. And so don't ever let anybody tell you that being involved in politics doesn't make a difference. You're living proof, Remedios, that it does make a difference. So, Mauricio, I don't know, does everybody read the Capitol Hill Cuban blog? I hope you do. Mauricio's a tiger. He's fierce. He loves his job, clearly. He loves the fight for freedom. And I love the fact that he goes toe-to-toe with the editorial board of the New York Times. It just warms my heart. But his advocacy work in Washington, D.C. is really relevant and very important. Today, I'd like to put the US-Cuba relationship in the context of a broader question, and Lincoln brought this up, which is the role of the United States in the world. Because right now, the world appears to be unraveling. We have a bloody civil war in Syria where literally millions of people are refugees in countries destabilizing those regimes, and almost 200,000 lives have been lost as Syrians fight amongst themselves and outside groups do the same. Iraq's fragile democracy has weakened to the point of crisis. ISIS has filled that void in Iraq and Syria with more than 20,000 battle-hardened jihadists, 500 of whom are estimated to be American citizens, and many more from Europe. They don't stamp a passport when you go into ISIS world, by the way, that says you're allowed back in. We have no clue where every one of these people are. And it's a serious concern. Iran continues to build capacity for a nuclear weapon, even as economic sanctions for the country have been eased. And while it negotiates with the United States, its supreme leader literally calls with a PowerPoint presentation for the annihilation of Israel. 1 week before the deferral of these conversations, a dictator, an autocrat, publishes, and you can go online and get it, a five-point PowerPoint presentation calling for the annihilation of the United States' strongest ally in the region. Russia invades Crimea and eastern Ukraine and threatens its neighbors with little response from NATO and the United States. China is flexing its muscles, not just economically, but militarily in Asia. The United States has played a role in this unraveling by pulling back from our traditional role that has literally helped create security and stability in the world in the post-World War II era. President Obama's indecisiveness, his concern for domestic political considerations in the formulation of foreign policy, his seeming inability to engage in the personal diplomacy needed to build the trust to be able to forge consensus in foreign policy, what the heck, I might as well mention domestic policy as well in that regard. His disinterest in laying out a coherent policy in spite of his incredible oratorical skills. He has the capacity to lay out what his vision is, but in this unstable and uncertain world, the United States has actually played a part in creating greater instability and greater unraveling. So what should the role of the United States be in the world? First, I think the United States needs to lead. Lead with humility, lead with respect, but lead. We are not an equal partner in the so-called community of nations. We are a leader among equals. Let's be honest. But for us, who? Who stands for freedom? Who stands for security? Who stands for stability in the world but for the United States? Nothing and no one can replace American leadership. We've seen the result of retrenchment and the impacts that it now has in creating an unstable world. We need to have a policy not of unilateralism, although no option should ever be taken off the table. Both our country and our president should never negotiate in advance any kind of consideration, but we need a policy of engagement. Secondly, our foreign policy should have the dual and interconnected purpose of security and the advancement of democracy in the world. Despots don't invade their neighbors. Autocrats stabilize their neighborhoods. Leaders elected in the open and vigorous democracies don't do anything like that. They are secure and peaceful inside their own borders, and they also project peace and security in their neighborhoods. Democracy and the struggle for human rights and other Western values are important in and of themselves, but need to be tempered with the limits of imposing values from the outside and the fact that the fight for freedom is a long-term struggle. A point consistently missed by our State Department is that democracy and freedom is not just about elections. Think of the elections that have been hijacked by the Chavistas, by Hezbollah, by Hamas, and by many other places where they win an election and the State Department and officialdom in our country says fine, but the simple fact is they use that election then to hijack the freedoms and the rule of law and the institutions of civil society that make it possible for people to live free lives. My third suggestion is that we need to re-nourish the alliances that have been the hallmark of stability in the world in the post-World War II era. NATO, the relationship in our neighborhood, Canada and Mexico, Israel, the ASEAN countries, and of course building a coalition of democratic leaders of countries in Latin America. The free market countries of Latin America need to be nurtured. We need to be actively engaged to protect their democracies and also to allow for the expansion of free market economics and liberty in the region. But for a handful of countries, think about this, in the last 6 years, there has been very little improvement in the relations. Despite all the fanfare of President Obama's election and his winning a Nobel Peace Prize in literally his first 6 months or 9 months of office, the relationship the United States has, because we have retrenched, has created worse relations than what we had before. Fourth, words matter. Presidents need to set United States aspirations and intentions where there is little gap between words and deeds. Think of the Russian reset. Think of the Syrian red line. Think of the pivot to Asia. Think of taking out ISIS. All of these things were perhaps important, but none of them have been accomplished, and it's created a big gap between our rhetoric and our action, and it undermines our credibility in the world. Our allies don't trust us, and our enemies don't fear us. There is no situation worse for stability and peace than that. The iron rule of superpower deterrent is mean it when you say it, and it has been broken by this president. Fifth, we should avoid timelines and deadlines that are really for domestic consumption that diminish the foreign policy impact. Iraq and Afghanistan are vivid examples of this. Look, there are thousands of troops in Korea today as a vestige of the Korean War, and it has created stability in a peninsula where there is a regime on the northern border of South Korea that would do everything possible to undermine that, not just Korea, but the rest of the world. And it's the 5,000 to 10,000 troops, well-trained American troops, that creates that security. This president missed an opportunity to do the exact same thing in Iraq, and thankfully I think he's seen the light as it relates to Afghanistan. But we should never say that we're leaving because it's important for a political campaign or it's important for domestic purposes. To leave, to do it in the right way based on our security interests is fine, but to do so simply because it is politically expedient is the wrong thing to do. 6, we need to rebuild our defense capability and maintain our intelligence capabilities, second to none. A great power needs to have the military wherewithal so that when our word is stated and it is matched by our deeds, we have the capability of acting in a way where we will be victorious. And in the 21st century, that means respect and support for the greatest military in the world, the United States military. A strong Navy, a cybersecurity strategy that places us in the forefront of protecting the homeland. Special forces second to none. And a superiority of technology across the board, which we maintain and we need to continue to maintain, but that requires money. My hope is that this coming session of Congress, that the Republicans now in leadership will do just that. 7th, we need to embrace free trade and economic integration. Integration creates positive interdependency. Free trade has lifted millions of people out of poverty and provides growing markets for jobs creating in our own country. This idea, when we've lost our confidence, I think is a dangerous thing, that we should be embracing a free trading climate where prosperity accrues to both sides. Free trade is also important for stability and freedom. We should advance free trade agreements in Asia and Europe, and just as important, I believe, we should be invigorating free trade agreements in the Americas again. We should not lose sight of the aspirational goal of Presidents Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, for a free trading region from Patagonia to Canada. It would create huge, huge benefits, and frankly, selfishly, if you look at a map, the center of gravity of that kind of trading agreement is right here at the Biltmore. Finally, for America to restate its role in the world again, for peace and democracy and security, we need to grow our economy at a far faster rate. The pessimism that exists in this country is that we have declining median income in the first recovery in modern times. The middle class is being squeezed, people are deeply pessimistic, and we need a high-growth strategy over a long period of time where people feel comfortable that they and their children can achieve earned success. And that means an energy policy based on North American resources and American innovation. It means shifting to an immigration policy that allows us to, in effect, have the first 250 to 300,000 first-round draft picks, the best and the most aspirational people in the world to come to this country to invest in their dreams, to create opportunities for themselves, their families, and for the rest of us. We need to move away from using immigration as a political lever to gain votes and focus on it as an economic tool for sustained growth. We need to reform the wackiest tax code in the world and the regulatory system that has made it harder and harder for a dynamic country like the United States to grow and prosper. If we were to grow at a faster rate, a foreign policy that would be more engaged, more involved, more leading the world, I think would come naturally. And so that has to be part of the foreign policy considerations going forward. What about Latin America? Well, a year ago, Secretary of State John Kerry told the Organization of American States that the Monroe Doctrine, the policy established by President James Monroe in 1823, was over. While it is true that times have definitely changed since 1983, and the need for intervention in countries to stop the advance of extracontinental powers may no longer exist in the traditional sense, today there's a new reality, a large presence and a growing presence of other actors from outside the region. Fronts are opening up for Islamic terrorism in Latin America, especially but not limited to Venezuela and to Ciudad de Este in Paraguay, that could create significant security challenges in the hemisphere. China has filled the void of our disinvestment by the United States in the region with billions of dollars of investment and loans, with the net result of significantly growing influences in places that a decade ago no one would have ever imagined. Russia is doing something also that is unimaginable today, just a few years ago, which is working to secure a naval presence in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and is selling arms at record levels into the region. To counteract this influence and achieve a stronger tie with our neighborhood in Latin America through sound policies, the United States must have a firm commitment to the true development of the region, economic freedom, and especially representative democracy. The United States must stand firm against demagogues who claim to be democratic but do not rule as such. This administration has been way too passive as it relates to this, which brings me why we're here today. Cuba is a dictatorship, plain and simple. In spite of this irrefutable fact, many in our country are calling for the lifting of the embargo. Today, and I bet many people know friends and others that fit into this category, literally hundreds of thousands of people travel to Cuba from the United States, spending billions of dollars. Let's assume for a moment, let's assume for one brief moment, that those that want to lift the embargo have pure motives of supporting freedom and democracy on the island. How would the lifting of the embargo do that? Explain that to me. Would the lifting of the embargo change the fact that the government receives almost all of the money that comes for these people, well-intended people that travel to the island? Would the ladies in white stop being harassed, beaten, and jailed? Would the internet be open to Cubans with access to uncensored news and divergent views? Would someone be elected that had a different view than the current communist regime? Could a Cuban decide to set up a business legally and keep what he earns? Of course not. The United States should only have a new relationship with Cuba when there is progress on basic human rights for the Cuban people, including the release of political prisoners, fair and free elections, the respect of the rule of law, the cessation of destabilizing countries in the region, and the embrace of a free market economy. Then and only then should it be lifted. And while we're at it, we should demand the release of not just political prisoners that valiantly and heroically dissent against the Castro regime. We should also be much more engaged in bringing the release of Alan Gross, who is on his 5th anniversary of detention in the country. In fact, I would argue that instead of lifting the embargo, we should consider strengthening it again to put pressure on the Cuban regime. And in doing so, we should encourage other countries in the region to do what's right, to stand for the principles that in the great majority of cases in the region, they do each and every day. They respect the rule of law. They believe in civil society. They believe in freedom. They believe in democracy. They act on that in their own countries, and they should try to do the same as it relates to their relationship with Cuba, which means that a good place to start would be the 7th Summit of the Americas to be held in April of next year in Panama. Cuba should not be allowed to go unless they embrace the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and the United States should be much more actively engaged in assuring that our voice is heard as it relates to this. Look, let's be clear. I am not a pessimist about the future of Cuba because I think human dignity and human freedom wins out over the long haul, over repression and communism. The Castro brothers are on the wrong side of history. They are an unfortunate, sad, tragic relic of Cuba's past. But dying dictators eventually die. They do die eventually. And when they do, the chance for us to engage in a thoughtful, positive way to bring about democracy and freedom in Cuba will be led by leaders that are in this room, leaders that care about the connection that our great Lieutenant Governor and our Congressman-elect talked about, connecting back to the past, but also focusing on the future of the people of Cuba. Miami and other people of the Cuban diaspora are going to play a huge role in this. And we should never lose sight of the chance of this happening is closer to today than it was in the past. So do not lose hope. Continue to provide support for the elected officials that are courageously doing the right thing in Washington, D.C. and other places. Quiero dar las gracias a todos ustedes presentes aquí, haciendo la buena lucha por la democracia y la libertad de Cuba. Yo estoy honrado de ser un soldado en tu ejército. Gracias a todos ustedes.
And I come now with good news that lunch will be served. But I also like to recognize the Attorney General of the state of Utah is here with us today, Sean Reyes. Sean, welcome to Florida.